So let me tell you what this video was going to be about. And then I started thinking about the kinds of things I was going to say, and fully changed my mind about what I'm going to talk about. I was going to talk about DMPCs, mainly because it's something I haven't talked about yet, but also because, like, I was trying to think of any time when there's been a good DMPC, about like the motivations for having a DMPC and how, and like the problems that you run into with having one. Now, by DMPC, I don't mean like any kind of, well, first off, self-insert characters, pretty bad all the way around. Full stop, regardless of system. Don't do a self-insert character. But DMPCs as the DM, or in some cases the GM, their attempt to play the game alongside the players, either because like the party is too small and they need a supplementary character, or because they really want to play but they're forced to run the game, and so they're going to try and do both at the same time. This is where you run into problems. A DMPC is, in the context of Dungeons and Dragons, pretty universally a bad idea. And then I started to think, as I was like, you know, sort of mentally prepping the talking points for like why a DMPC is bad. I started to think about how it's mainly due to D&D's objective-based, or was it obstacle-based game design, where the entire game is sort of oriented around, and I've talked about this in half a dozen videos already, all of D&D, and in every edition, it's really geared for a series of obstacles en route to an objective. You have the thing you want to accomplish, beat the big bad, save the world, whatever it is. And there's a series of obstacles that you have to overcome. Maybe it's not linear. Maybe there's some choices in there. Like you're doing a dungeon and it's a non-linear dungeon, or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be like a line. I'm not saying it's linear necessarily, but it is just overcome an obstacle. Good. Now there's another one. Okay. Now there's another one. And that's the cycle. Now, not all obstacles are the same. Sometimes it's a fight. Sometimes it's a social encounter. Sometimes it's a heist. Sometimes it's, a skill challenge. Sometimes you're sneaking in. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily a bad thing. The characters in a story have to have obstacles to overcome. This is necessary. But D&D only has obstacles. It does not have other kinds of scenes or challenges for the characters. And so, in thinking about that, I thought, well, I don't actually have a lot to say about DMPCs, because I think a lot of what I have to say is pretty obvious. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. I don't think I can fill out a whole video about it. But what I can do is talk about the root cause of DMPCs being bad and how to get around that. And that is to have a game where not everything is about overcoming obstacles. And then I realized I've talked about this a lot. It kind of is a problem, or it creates problems elsewhere in the system, just simply by existing as an underlying philosophy. I've mentioned it several times, and now I'm going to talk about it in detail. Not objective-based, obstacle-based game design. So as I just said, there's nothing wrong with having obstacles, but you need to have other kinds of situations for the characters to be in, where there isn't an obstacle to overcome, or there is, but there's something else going on that either makes them unable to address it or unwilling to address it. And it would be a good thing for the freedom of storytelling if you don't have to have an obstacle every time. If a D&D character is in a situation where there's no obstacle to overcome, they're just like dealing with a relationship, or they're, pouring their heart out to another character about the struggles that they've been having, these kinds of scenes, like, you can do that with role-playing And a lot of seasoned role players are going to, pretty naturally lean into that. Particularly if you play with like theater kids, which I've done. And I mean, like, I recommend that. But the game itself does not have any support for those kinds of scenes. What character abilities, what's on your character sheet that's going to lean towards that? And now I know what you're going to say. It's not about what's on your character sheet. Your character sheet can't tell you how to roleplay. Well, you're right. But games that do support those kinds of scenes and have mechanics for them and have maybe character abilities that, or character abilities or general game rules that interact with those kinds of scenes, those are games where you can have non-obstacle based encounters, for lack of a better word, which means that there's a lot more freedom in the kinds of stories that you can tell that are supported by the game itself. Because you don't need a game to role play. You don't. And that is, in fact, the approach that D&D takes, is that, like, you don't need rules for role playing. So we're not going to give you any rules for role playing, And that's kind of historically what D&D has always done. And they kind of like, a few rules here and there, like, here you want to use a skill challenge for some kind of like social argument. Sure. You want to use 5th edition's like really janky NPC attitude scale. Sure, I guess. But none of these really address like what it means to really go into a scene without an objective in mind, or not even without an objective, but without like a strategy for overcoming a set obstacle. You probably have an objective, but the interesting part of the scene is not how am I going to get to the objective. It's what's going to happen that's going to change the way our characters feel about each other, about the world, about themselves. These are things that a game can address, that a game can support, but D&D generally does not. And of course, anytime I'm going to talk about like a game that supports role-playing, I'm going to talk about L5R. Legend of the Five Rings is a fantastic game for this specific kind of play. In particular, the dice system that L5R 5th edition uses, where you have like opportunities that you can spend to like learn about the advantages and disadvantages or the demeanor of a character or how much strife they have, so how stressed out they are. And the setting that it gives, and setting is so important to this. And I think this is where D&D really extra suffers, is that it doesn't basically have a default, like it has a default setting. The Forgotten Realms is D&D's default setting, although I think are they changing that to Greyhawk in the 2024 books? I think they're changing it to Greyhawk. Could be wrong about that, but I did hear that somewhere. In any event, these sort of like just generic blasé kind of fantasy worlds don't really lend themselves to really interesting social interaction. Whereas you have a setting like Rokugan, where social interaction is the thing. Like the social mores on these characters are just so interesting to really dive into. It's kind of the whole point of the setting, is like, let's play out a samurai drama or a samurai tragedy or something like that, where these are really tragic characters, and that makes them really interesting. And the society that they live in is so deeply flawed, and the effects that has on these characters, the sort of like generational trauma, if you want to call it, cultural trauma, I think actually might be a better term for it. The things that this culture does to these people, and the way that it makes them behave, and the way that it makes them think about things. And sort of, diving in and exploring that is, in my opinion, kind of the main point of L5R. So if I go into a scene in L5R where, like it's my character and maybe their love interest or their rival or, a confidant that maybe like I as a player know might not be as trustworthy as my character thinks. These are the kinds of interactions that are going to be absolutely choice for L5R. In D&D, they would be kind of flat, because there's no mechanical and there's no setting reason for these interactions to be that interesting. And I don't think you can really just chalk that up to like, well, if the DM tried harder, they could make these more interesting. Like you can simply by working really hard at characterization. But my point is that in D&D, the game does not give you any help on that. Whereas in a game like L5R, it does. Part of that comes down to the dice system, the non-binary resolution, where like you incorporate your approach on every roll. You can sort of get you can use opportunities to get side objectives. You don't have to succeed or fail for those. Those certainly help. The setting helps a lot. And it's and bringing this back around to my original point about DMPCs, the reason why a DMPC would work better in a game like that is specifically because the GM can focus on things other than trying to overcome obstacles. Because if the GM is putting an obstacle in the way and then their character has the tools or the proficiencies to get through that obstacle, well, that's kind of lame, isn't it? For the other players? Like that feels like the GM is playing with themselves. Whereas in a game where not everything is an obstacle, then the DMPC can be a foil for the other characters. It can be like an interesting bouncing off point for the other characters. In a way that maybe in a stronger fashion than a normal NPC could be. And then I think DMPCs are not so bad. This has actually happened to me. I was in a L5R campaign. There was only 3 players, and the GM wanted to have a character for themselves that is sort of representative of the kinds of characters that they like. My character did not like this character at all. They were philosophically like opposites. But what has come of this in the long run is that now in my campaign, those characters have come forward, and we kind of like, time skip a few years, and that relationship, that really complex relationship that was built up in the previous campaign, is now reverberating into future campaigns. It's working out really well, and not just because we're all cool, mature players, but because the game itself says that it's okay to have characters that are not necessarily like a staunch ally who's going to help you overcome objectives. There's other things for characters to do, such as, discuss relationships, offer advice on philosophy, offer differing points of view, those kinds of things. To be a foil for a particular character. That's perfectly valid reason for a character to exist. So, DMPCs in D&D, I think, pretty universally inadvisable. But that has more to do with the game that it's in than it has to do with the actual practice of the GM having their own personal character that they invest more into, that they think more about, that is their character. Which I think is fine in certain contexts. Particularly if the game supports it, like some do, but D&D does not.